Now, if you have not had a chance, there's outlines in the back, but also with that outline is this prayer list that we have. Now, as you're looking at this, I'm looking at this prayer list, and you could there are names on here that we've had for months. We've had some of these on here for longer than that. And each one of those are desperately asking for us to pray for them. I started looking at this, and I started looking at all the different things going on, whether it be physically, like a lot of these are, whether it be not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. And then we have a lot of people that are really crying out for help. And I think no other time than what has been taking place, this is a good time to talk about Job. Job is one of those that it's timeless. There was Victor Hugo is an author, and he wrote Les Miserables, I believe. And he said of all books, if you could only pick one book in the whole entire world, he said he would pick the book of Job to be saved. He said it is, by more than anything else, it is the Mount Everest of books. And so he spoke highly of it. A lot of people do. And for us, I want us to dive into, this is going to be kind of an introduction of what the book's about. And we're going to have some other lessons on some different topics that it talks about here in the book of Job. And I think that for us, we need to be mindful that we are not alone. And it sure sometimes feel like it. I mean, when you're going through pain and struggle, whether it be emotional, whether it be physical, mental, spiritual, man, it just feels like it's just you. Job felt that way. Matter of fact, the name Job, it comes from a Hebrew, which can be called or thought of as one persecuted. And some say it actually comes from Arabic, and the Arabic meaning to repent. I'm not sure exactly the beginnings of where his name came from, but it could have been something very similar to the fact that sometimes names are given to what you're going to have to endure or what you're going to be. You think of the mother of all living things, and God called the woman Eve because of that in Genesis chapter 3, verse 20. Or you think about Abram's name was changed to Abraham in Genesis chapter 17, verse 5, because he was going to be the father of many nations. I'm not sure if this is any indication of what he was going to suffer later in life. But I do know that suffer he does. And number one, and these are the points. We're going behind the curtain and we're looking at the characters here. Today we're just looking at the main people in here. And the first one's going to be Satan. Number two is going to be the servant. And not the serpent, the servant. And number three is going to be the sovereign. And so as we go through, going back up to number one, Satan. Satan, it's amazing as you look in this book of Job, the different things that he does. Matter of fact, in chapter 1, verse 10, he says, you have a hedge around Job. If it weren't for that, he'd curse you. There's no way. He does that again in chapter 2, 4, and 5. He says, you protected him. But if I can touch skin for skin, then he would change. And so here you have the letter A is attitude. That's the attitude of Satan. He doesn't care. He's looking for you. And it says in Revelation 12:10 that he's always accusing the brothers. He's a continual accuser. So he's there. Amidst all the angels, when they're there, all of a sudden Satan's there. He says, what are you doing here? Well, I've been coming to and fro. I've been going back and forth. He says, well, have you considered my servant Job? And he says, well, you've got a hedge around him. You know, if you weren't protecting him, he wouldn't be loyal to you. That's basically in a nutshell what he's saying. You know, we know that he's walking around prowling like a roaring lion from 1 Peter chapter 5:8, right? He was going back and forth then. He's still doing the same thing. His actions and his mode hasn't changed. He's still boldly coming and accusing and looking for someone to devour. And after all, it shouldn't be surprised. He'll do anything to get you. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 14, it says he even masquerades as an angel of light. So he will do anything to get you. And he's after Job. Now, that is Satan's attitude. He's going to stop at nothing to get you. He's going to stop at nothing to get Job and to show Jesus that if you aren't protecting, if you aren't giving, then there's not going to be any loyalty. I think that Satan does the same thing with us. Let me take something from them, or let me cause them a trial. Remember the difference between a trial and temptation. Temptation is inward and trial is outward. And so he does these different things. He tempts us as well, but he has these different trials that we go through at different times that sometimes isn't caused by God, it's caused by Satan. And he does those things because his attitude is he can't wait to devour you. He wants to scoop you up as quick as he can because he truly feels if you aren't being protected by God, there's no loyalty. I don't think he ever learned the lesson because he's still after it today. But the second thing is you look at his actions. You look at his actions and that's letter B, and he goes on the attack of Job. Matter of fact, Job, in chapter 1, verse 3, he's got 7,000 sheep. He's got 3,000 camel. He's got 500 yoke of oxen. So that means he's got 1,000 oxen. He's got 500 female donkeys. Doesn't talk about the male donkeys. So you know there was some there. And he has a massive amount. There's no one greater in the East than him. He's the greatest man. And he goes on the attack. And how he attacks is a little bit different. He attacks his fortune that we just mentioned. And so the first thing is, you see in chapter 14, you have all of a sudden, they're plowing the fields. And in verse 15, a group comes in and attacks and wipes them out. There's only one servant left. And then in chapter 6, or verse 16, now fire consumes, and now there's no more sheep. And then the next, you have in verse 17, you have camels there. They go, they take them away, and now you only have one servant left. And he's totally taken his wealth away in just an instant. And he only has 3 servants left. But then you see that the next one is probably the most gut-wrenching. It's because he doesn't just take his fortune, he takes his family. And you look in verse 19, it says, a great wind came across the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people. And they're all dead. And I alone, one servant, have escaped to tell you. He's got 4 servants left. Everything else is gone. And he's even going to make life so miserable for Job that his wife is going to turn on him and be a discourager of discouragers. And just say, why don't you give up on God? He's no good to you. He doesn't even care about you. Why don't you curse God and die? And so he's lost his fortune. And by all rights, he lost all of his kids. And his wife is not equally yoked anymore. And so he's lost his family. And then comes in the attack on his fitness. And so when this takes place, if you look in chapter 2, verse 7, it says, my version says, with loathsome sores. And so they were from foot to his head. So the sole of his feet to the top of his head. And so we know that these sores were all over and how painful it is. And some mention that it's boils. Some versions will say boils, but we know whatever it is, we know there's a breakout all over. And then in verse 8, it says he took a piece of pottery and he was scraping his skin. And so this might indicate that it was itching or just trying to get it off and just remove whatever it is. And in verse 12 of chapter 2, it says, and when they saw him, talking about his friends from a distance, they did not recognize him. And so many believe that what he had was either leprosy or elephantitis or elephantiasis. And that is enlargement of certain areas of your body where it disfigures you. And it might be possible because of some of the indications that he talks about him weeping. It talks about he's infested with worms. And that would be an infestation that is caused by a parasite, a worm. And so it may be something like that. But he's disfigured. And then in chapter 3, verse 24, it says, my sign comes instead of my bread. He's having trouble even eating. He's in so much pain. In verse 25, it says, for the thing I fear the most has come upon me, and that I dread befalls me. You talking about depressed. The one thing that he didn't want is happening. Now you think about the one thing, there's just one thing that you would never want to happen. And if that happened to you, what would happen to your faith? So as you go on, chapter 7, verse 5, it says, my flesh is clothed with worms and dirt. He's infested. And it says, my skin hardens, then breaks out afresh. And so you can get the sense of it's oozing out. His skin's breaking and there's this ooze and it's just running from the sores. Chapter 9, look in verse 18. He says, and he will not let me get my breath, but fills me with bitterness. And so indicates that he's so bitter, in all this pain going on, he might be having a hard time breathing. Chapter 16, verse 16. It says, my face is red with weeping. I kind of mentioned that that's one of the side effects. But we know that he's weeping. And it says, and my eyelids in deep darkness. So his eyes are just darkened. He's continually weeping. In verse 19, or chapter 19, verse 17, it says, my breath is strange to my wife, and I'm a stench to the children of my own mother. In other words, he has such an odor about him, no one wants to even get close. In chapter 19, the same chapter, in verse 20, it says, my bones stick to my skin and to my flesh, and I've escaped by the skin of my teeth. He's saying, I've dwindled down. I'm a fraction of what I was as a man, and I've survived by the skin of my teeth. In other words, there's no reason I should still be here. I should be dead. I mean, you look at all the things that I've gone through and all the issues and the trials and this tribulation I'm going through. I should be dead right now. Just by the skin of my teeth, I'm alive, and I don't even understand why I'm alive. And so you look at that, the actions are all written out there. He takes his fortune, he takes his family, he takes his fitness, and his friends try to take his faith. They accuse him of saying, and we're going to talk about this later on, but they even go as far as to say, you have abused women. You have abused orphans. They're going beyond not just saying you must have done something, but now they start attacking him later on. Can you imagine? You've got friends that come to visit, and you're in deep despair and depression and suffering physically, and all they're going to do is talk about everything that you've done wrong. And then on top of that, they start making stuff up. That's what's going on with Job. So he got everything around him. You ever felt like you're on an island all by yourself? And sometimes we feel like it. And sometimes we're in a crowd and we feel all alone. Man, Job really is all alone. There's no one that thinks of him in the elevated light that they did. Here is a man, he's going to talk about all the things that he's done. But they're going to say, nope, you've done something. You've done something that, And so looking at that, his wife, his kids are no longer. He's having to go through this pain, and he's physically, that he's having to deal with, but emotionally, he can't even get over the fact of his family. And so looking at Satan, his whole aim, because you've got his action, you got his attitude, his action, and then you have his aim. His aim is set there, and his aim is true. His aim is so he will curse God. That's what he wants. You go back to chapter 1. His aim is for you to be unloyal, for you to turn your back on God. In chapter 1, verse 11, he says, but stretch out your hand and touch that he has, and he will curse you to your face. In chapter 2, verse 5, it says something very similar. But stretch out your hand and touch his bones and his flesh, and he'll curse you to his face. In other words, Job's only faithful because of what God can do for Job. And sometimes our faith goes through that same type of thing. Sometimes we let Satan win because we're faithful in the good times, but sometimes we're not even faithful in the good times. Job is showing no matter the good, the bad, or the ugly, he's going to be faithful. And so going to number 2, the servant. The servant Job. You look at this attitude. All these things have been taken away. His fortune and every servant except for 4 guys, along with his kids. All that stuff has been taken away. And you look at the attitude. So number 2 is servant, and the letter A under that, it would be attitude. You look at his attitude, and it's quite amazing. In verse 21 of chapter 1, he said, naked I came into my mother's womb. And we've heard this before. And naked I shall return. The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. And here's the initial attitude. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And in all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. That's the initial. And a lot of times when we face the trial right up front, man, we're great. We're positive. Hey, we're going to get through this. We're going to be able to do this. Whatever this is, we're going to make through this. But then time starts going on and you're like, there's no relief. And eventually as you keep going, there's no relief. You start kind of wondering, don't you? Well, aren't we done with this? Haven't I learned the lesson? You know, we know we're supposed to count it all joy when we face trials of many kinds, is what James chapter 1 talks about. And I think I've had a pretty good little attitude about this. But now I'm tired. I'm done. I'm worn out. Let's move on with things. Well, this isn't just an overnight thing for Job. I want you to look at chapter 7, verse 3. This indicates that this isn't days. This isn't one day. This isn't days. This is months. In chapter 7, verse 3, it says, so I'm allotted months of emptiness and nights of misery are appointed to me. So he is in this for the long term. You go to chapter 29, it's going to say something very similar. It says, oh, that I were as in the months of old, as in the days when God watched over me. He's saying, I wish I could go back months ago, before all this stuff started. So we're talking about this is going on for months. And you think about the stuff that you're going on, and some of these on this list, they've been going through it for months. They're struggling. They're having a hard time, and for months. And so you see his attitude initially. Man, praise be the name of God. And then there's an effect. This thing starts taking place. It starts taking its toll. Because Satan knows if I just give it to you a little bit, but I'm going to keep coming after you. Just like he did in Matthew chapter 4 with Jesus. He kept coming after Jesus in Matthew. And so here we see letter B is the effect. The effect that it takes on him. We see that it's months. And so the first one under effect would be desire. His desire is totally changed. You look in, and I'm going to read from a different version here of Job chapter 3. And it says in Job chapter 3 verse 1, and this is called the easy to read version. It was written to be able to have a Bible for the deaf. It was called the Bible of the deaf at one point. And so just reading this, it says, then Job opened his mouth and cursed the day he was born. He said, I wish the day that I was born would have been lost forever. I wish the night they said, it's a boy, had never happened. I wish that day had remained dark. I wish God above had forgotten that day and not let any light shine on it. I wish that bitter day had remained as dark as death, covered with the darkest clouds. I wish my darkness had carried away that night, that it was left on the calendar and not included in any of the months. I wish that night had produced nothing and no happiness, no happy shouts had been heard. Some magicians think they may wake Lathian. So I say to their curses and curse the day I was born. Let that day's morning be a star. Let that night await for the morning that never comes. I wish I had never seen the first rays of sunlight. I wish I had stopped me from being born. Can you imagine? I just wish I had never been born. That's where he's at. His desire is to never be born. He's like, I wish I had never had this happen. That's what he really wants. I just wish, because I'm in so much pain. Physically and emotionally, mentally and spiritually, I'm in so much. I just want it to be done. I just wish I had never experienced it, just if I hadn't been born. And so you notice there's a lot of people that are like that. They just are just at the edge, and they're like, I wish this had never happened. I wish I'd never been born. And they do things that are permanent to themselves. But Job never talks about ending his own life. That's never even a thought. Because he's got something that we need to make sure that we have. He has spiritual resilience. He's going to be resilient no matter what, but he's just wishing, hoping, and desiring they'd never been born. But he doesn't take any action on it. You know, there's sometimes we think certain things, but we don't take action. And so, as it goes on, he talks about not just that, but there from 11 down to 20, he says, in verse 11, says, why didn't I die when I was born? Now he goes on the next 10 verses saying, I wish I hadn't had a childhood. Okay, if I was born, fine, but I wish I would never lived long. I would have died in my childhood because I wouldn't have had to suffer all that I'm suffering. You talking about a guy, he's done. And he's just hoping, God, just give me some relief. And so his desire is never to be born. His desire is to never have a childhood. And then look in 20 and 21. It says, why must a suffering person continue to live? Why let anyone live such a bitter life? Such people want to die, but death does not come. They search for death more than a hidden treasure. So the next point, that's his desire. Now we see the depression setting in. He's got nowhere to turn. He's not going to take his life. That's not the solution. And he doesn't know how to get out of it. And he's just depressed. There's depression that's sitting in because these months are going on. They're extending and there's no hope in sight. You ever been there? And then, verse 22, they would be happy to find their grave. They would rejoice to find their tomb. But God keeps their future a secret and builds a wall around them to protect them. When it is time to eat, all I can do is sigh with sadness, not joy. My groans pour out like water. And as what we read before, what I was afraid something terrible would happen, and what I feared the most has happened. And so at this point, there's nothing but despair. He desires never to be born, never to have a childhood. He says, man, I'm just depressed. And that's how he phrases it in those verses. And then he's in despair. There's nothing he can do. Ever felt helpless? Well, that's what Job's feeling like. He's feeling really helpless. And isn't this a time to be talking about it? When we have all these lists of folks that are struggling in myriad of ways. And we have a lot of people that just remain they're not communicating exactly what's going on with them. And they're struggling too. They're just not on this list. Whole bunch of folks. And people in our lives that we love and care about, not just here. And so the next one, number 3, is the sovereign. We can't leave God out of this. If we could only see what God sees, if we could truly know what he thinks about us. Because I think if Job, turn to chapter 1, if Job knew exactly what God thought about Job, this whole book would have been written differently. And it's a good thing it wasn't. Because if you're like me, it's good to have reminders of what God thinks about you. Look in chapter 1, verse 8. And look at what he says about Job. He's saying to Satan, have you considered, because he's saying, I'm going back and forth looking for somebody. He said, well, have you considered my servant Job? And look at that phrase, that there is none like him on the earth. There's nobody else like him. He's blameless. That means he's not perfect. He's not innocent. It means you can't find something. There's not a habit in his life that's sinful. When he sees it, he adjusts. He's blameless. He's upright. He does those things that are righteous. He fears God and turns away from evil. I've got no one like him. You need to look at him because that's my starting ace right there. That's my starting quarterback. I mean, there's nothing else like him. And then he says that he won't. You know, it's just amazing. He says there's no way that you're going to be able to turn him. And then he says, well, you know, skin for skin. He says, you bet. Go ahead. I've got no one like him. He holds fast to his integrity. Look in chapter 2, verse 3. He says, once again, when he's upset, when Satan's upset, going back and forth, he says, consider my servant Job. And again, that there is none like him on the earth, blameless and upright, who fears the Lord and turns from evil. He still holds fast his integrity, meaning he is innocent of wrongdoing. Even though all that you've done, you've enticed to try to destroy him, he's still standing. Because the sovereign is showing that he admires Job. This isn't one of those things where Job is getting picked on. Job has gotten chosen to suffer for his name's sake. Very similar to what Paul said. Hey, I'm going to show him he's my chosen instrument to suffer for my name. So he has actually been chosen. So if Job would have known he had been chosen, he might have thought a little bit differently about himself and the situation going on. He doesn't realize he's the one that God has elevated, saying, above all the people on the earth, try to touch him, you can't do it. There's nobody like him. Now you think about that. He admires us. Today he admires us. Because it talks about in Psalm chapter 139, verse 14, that he delights in us. It talks about how we were made wonderful, fearfully wonderful in that verse. It talks about in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, that we are his masterpiece. And some versions will say workmanship. We are his masterpiece. It goes on to say in Psalm 18, verse 19, that he rescues us because he delights in us. He still admires us. He's still in love with us because at just the right time, Romans talks about that he sent his son just at the right time while we were still sinners. And so it's easy to forget what God truly thinks about us when we're going through it, whatever it is. And then he feels like, you know, sometimes we do, like we've done something to hurt or to harm and cause God not to like us. And that's totally opposite. Sometimes we forget what he thinks of us, and I think Job did too. We feel like he hates us, and it couldn't be further from the truth. Because after all, God so loved the world, right? That he gave his only son so he could save us. That's how much he admires us. And the last point here, letter B, is that he allows. He allowed Satan, but he limited. And that's for us what we've got to remember. He still allows, but there's a limit. And he limited Job. He said, yes, you can't touch him, but you can do whatever else. And Satan does. I mean, he goes all at it. And then the next thing, he comes back and says, okay, yeah, you can do skin for skin, but you can't take his life. But it doesn't mean that our life may not be taken now. Because you look at the different people, Stephen died for his faith. You look at Paul, eventually he's going to die for his faith later on, right? And then you have, after that, you're going to have Peter. You're going to have these different apostles that are all going to die. You have people in Revelation that are the martyrs that are saying, how long are we going to wait till we get justice? They died. So it doesn't mean that your life is going to be saved. But it does mean you can be rescued. And so he allows Satan, and this should make us remember that he shows confidence in Job by allowing Satan to go after him. I'm getting emotional because I'm thinking about all the times Satan has gone after the people I love. I'm thinking about this list here. I'm thinking of all those people that are struggling. I'm thinking about those people that aren't on this list, that haven't verbalized what they're going through. Don't forget that God has got confidence in you. He limits. And the limits are given, and it shows that God's still protecting you. He's still in love with you. He hasn't forgotten you. And so you need to remember a few things that the Lord admires you. You need to remember that the last sentence here, Satan still attacks. He still comes at you. It says in 1 Peter, as we mentioned, that he's still roaming and roaring like a lion, looking to devour. And we need to be ready. In Ephesians chapter 6, verse 13, it talks about putting on the armor, being ready, get ready. It talks about being alert. In 1 Peter, when he's roaring around like a lion, it says, be alert, because that's what he's doing. So we need to be ready. And in 1 Peter, which we've studied before, is in chapter 4, verse 12, says, don't be surprised when trials come upon you as though something strange were happening to you. So we need to remember that he still attacks. We need to be ready, be watchful, be alert, and not be surprised. But then that second part, Satan still attacks. And the second part of that sentence is, we still struggle. We still struggle. And that's why we have this lesson today. And we're going to have some more, because we still need to be reminded. We still struggle with this. We still have a hard time when we have trials, when we have temptations. But we do know one that's promised us, we won't be tempted beyond what we can bear. He had a trial, and that trial was leading to temptation for him to forsake God, for him to be disloyal and be unfaithful to God. That was the temptation. And it came through in shining colors. And for us, the temptation is there too. A lot of temptations. But we have a promise in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, that he's not going to let us have a temptation beyond what we're capable of and what's beyond what a common man goes through. But he allows us the strength to endure. And that's the promise, because it says God is faithful and he'll allow us to endure. The strength to endure. So he doesn't take it away, but he limits it. He admires us. He allows. And with all of this, it's amazing that Satan still attacks and that we still struggle, knowing the last blank there is that the Lord still rescues. He rescues each and every time. As I mentioned in Psalm chapter 18, verse 19, he rescued me because he delights in me. And that's what he does for us. He delights in us. So if you're struggling today, know that you will have one that admires you. He delights in you. He loves you. He's wanting to do and willing to do and has done everything to get you to come home. But if you're struggling, you need some prayers, and let us know what we can be praying for you about. And if you're not a child of God and you haven't put Christ on in baptism, and that's what it talks about, and having your sins washed away, as it talks about to get a new life in Romans chapter 6, 3 and 4. It talks about to get into Christ that way. There's no other way to get into him. We need to believe in him, but we can't believe into him. We need to repent, as it talks about in Luke. We need to repent for him, but we can't repent into him. We need to confess his name, but we can't confess into him. There's only two places to talk about getting into Christ. There's Romans chapter 6, 3 and 4, and Galatians chapter 3, 26 and 27. You're baptized into him. And then you're forgiven. And then you're a part of a larger spiritual family, the church. Let us know what we can do, because we're here to go to heaven together. And we're here to take everybody with us. Let us stand and sing.